They said I'd be homeless by 20. I made sure they had no office to come back to at 60. It sounds bitter, doesn't it? But it's not anymore. My name is Catherin. No middle name, no legacy to carry forward. Just Catherin. I used to hate how empty that sounded. Now, I understand the power in building a name from scratch. I was 12 when the Thompsons brought me home from the foster system. On paper, they looked perfect. A married couple running a mid-sized construction supply company, generous in public appearances, clean financials, nice house in the suburbs of Sacramento. They claimed I was the daughter they never had. In truth, I was a tax deduction with a heartbeat. At first, I clung to their kindness like a drowning girl to driftwood. I said yes to everything. I folded laundry before they asked. I ate quickly and quietly, always waiting until they were done. I memorized their coffee orders and never let the trash pile up. In return, I got polite smiles and an extra blanket in winter, but the warmth never reached their eyes. Mrs. Thompson introduced me to guests as our little rescue story. That's the word she used, rescue. Like I was a stray dog they picked up off the freeway. Mr. Thompson was more practical. He made sure I stayed in the garage-turned-bedroom, away from the main house, and kept reminding me, be grateful. Not everyone gets a second chance. Grateful. That word stuck to me like lint. I whispered it to myself before bed like a prayer, hoping it would transform my shame into something dignified. I wasn't allowed at the dining table. I ate in the kitchen after everyone else had finished. Cold meatloaf, leftover rice, sometimes just bread and milk. When I asked if I could eat with them, Mrs. Thompson said, "It's just easier this way, honey." Easier for who? I still remember the first time I said I wanted to be an architect. It was during dinner cleanup. I had just turned 14. Mr. Thompson laughed so hard he nearly spilled his wine. "An architect?" he chuckled. "Sweetheart, do you even know how to use a ruler?" Mrs. Thompson added, "Don't fill her head with nonsense, Richard. It'll only make things harder when she realizes people like her don't get to design buildings. They clean them. People like her." I washed the dishes with trembling hands that night, but I didn't cry. I learned not to cry. Crying didn't change anything. It only made them sigh louder and slam more doors. At 16, I started drawing floor plans in the back of my school notebooks. The lines weren't perfect, but they were mine. I found solace in symmetry, in imagining spaces where people felt safe, something I'd never had but deeply understood. I read books on structural design, watched free online lectures, and volunteered at Habitat for Humanity, pretending I was just another high schooler with a passion, not a girl hiding her bruises behind hard hats and nail guns. By 17, I pitched an idea to improve the layout of their warehouse, more efficient flow of materials, fewer accidents. I stayed up all night sketching it out, measuring shelves with a borrowed tape measure. Mr. Thompson skimmed the first page and scoffed. "Stick to sweeping floors, kid," he muttered. "You're not here to tell us how to run a business." A month later, they locked me out of the house for missing curfew. I had stayed late studying at the library. When I got home, the door was bolted. I slept in the garage, shivering under a tarp. On my 18th birthday, they handed me a backpack and a folded $50 bill. No cake, no goodbye. Just a sharp sentence I still hear sometimes in the back of my mind. If you end up on the streets, don't tell people you stayed here. We've got a reputation. And just like that, I was gone. I walked into the city with no safety net. I had no birth family to fall back on, no inheritance, no family photos, nothing but the burning, freezing truth that I was utterly on my own. But that night, alone on a park bench with a granola bar and a list of community shelters, I made a decision that would shape the next 15 years of my life. I will never be beneath anyone again, not in worth, not in voice, not in power. I didn't know how yet. I just knew I'd rather starve with dignity than be fed with contempt. I worked nights at a loading dock and spent my days at a local community college. I took online courses in logistics and supply chain management. I borrowed textbooks. I made friends with janitors, truck drivers, and small warehouse owners, anyone who'd teach me what they knew. I learned fast. I listened hard. I started saving every cent. When I couldn't afford a place to live, I shared studio apartments with 3 other girls who dreamed of becoming chefs and graphic designers. We rotated shifts, took turns cooking pasta and ramen, and believed in each other because no one else would. I registered my first business at 24. It was small, just me, 2 secondhand trucks, and a promise to always show up on time. I delivered building materials to construction sites no one wanted to deal with. Last-minute orders, bad weather, rural roads. I never said no. I learned routes, memorized client names, and stayed late if someone needed help unloading. Slowly, word spread. By 30, I owned 4 regional logistics companies under one umbrella brand. And by 33, today, I own enough voting shares to control the acquisition of a construction supply company that once dismissed a little girl's dreams with a smirk. Their company. The Thompsons haven't seen me in 15 years. They think they're meeting with a nameless logistics exec who wants to diversify her holdings. They have no idea. Not yet. Some scars don't show. They echo. Mine came in the form of silence. Cold. Habitual. Institutionalized. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in peaceful homes or warm libraries. It was the type that hovered in hallways, paused at dinner tables, and hardened in the corners of someone's eyes just before they said, "Not now." The Thompsons never yelled, not once. They didn't have to. Their rejection was orchestrated, polite, and performed like good manners. Every Sunday morning, they sat at the dining table sipping coffee and planning their week. I sat behind the kitchen island 10 feet away, waiting, always waiting. When they finished, I was allowed to reheat whatever was left. Scrambled eggs gone cold, a quarter of a muffin. Sometimes Mrs. Thompson would slide a plate across the counter and say, "There's enough if you're quick." I always was. At school, I stayed quiet. I didn't know how to answer the inevitable, "What do your parents do?" without feeling like I was plagiarizing someone else's life. Most kids brought cupcakes on their birthdays. I brought nothing and learned to duck my head when the teacher said, "Let's all sing." The hardest part wasn't the isolation. It was how convincingly normal everything looked from the outside. Once when I was 15, the Thompsons hosted a barbecue for their colleagues. Mrs. Thompson curled my hair and put me in a floral dress I'd never seen before. She told me to smile and be presentable. When someone asked if I was their daughter, she laughed. "Oh no, she's not ours. She's a foster kid. One of the ones the state sends. Tragic, really. But we try our best." I smiled, because that's what you do when you're a living goodwill receipt. That night, after the guests left, I excused myself early. In the garage, I sat on my cot and stared at the ceiling, blinking hard to keep the tears from falling. Not because of what she said, but because I believed it. By 17, I had memorized their routines. I knew which drawer the bills went into, how many ounces of bourbon Mr. Thompson poured after dinner, and which words made Mrs. Thompson flinch. I stayed useful, predictable, invisible. Then came the warehouse moment. It wasn't rebellion, I just thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see me as more than a mouth to feed. I had spent weeks observing how the pallets in their storage facility were stacked inefficiently, how the forklifts had to circle 3 times to reach basic materials. I sketched a redesign, optimized zones, safety corridors, inventory logic that would reduce their labor hours by 20%. I waited until Mr. Thompson was alone in his office and handed him the plan. He flipped through it lazily, didn't even read the notes. Cute. Did someone help you with this? No, I said. I did it myself. He closed the folder, smiled. Well then, maybe next you can redesign the break room. That's where you'll be if you keep dreaming like this. The folder was never opened again. I didn't argue. I just nodded, picked it up, and walked out. A week later, I came home from school late. Missed the last bus because I was staying after to study for a physics test. The house was dark, the front door was locked, the side gate was chained. There was a folded note taped to the garage door. "We told you curfew was 9 o'clock. You made a choice. Learn from it." I slept under the workbench that night, curled against a bag of mulch, trying to pretend the sharp pain in my ribs was just the cold. I never missed curfew again. On my last day in their house, if it could be called a house, I packed what little I had into a secondhand backpack. Before I walked out, Mrs. Thompson handed me a manila envelope. Inside were a handful of documents, school transcripts, a birth certificate copy, and a note that read, "We've removed you from our insurance. You're 18 now. Best of luck." Mr. Thompson added, "If you ever end up panhandling, don't use our name. We've got clients." I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence by then had become a survival skill. They watched me walk down the driveway, their porch light humming overhead, the only thing illuminating the girl they never claimed. That was the day I stopped asking for permission to exist. And that's also the day I started keeping receipts, not the paper kind, the kind that lives in memory, the kind you pull out 15 years later, not to prove someone wrong, but to remind yourself you survived. And that is not small. I was 17 when I first dared to believe that intelligence might matter more than bloodline. I had spent weeks refining the layout redesign for their warehouse, zone optimization, safety lanes, time motion studies from YouTube case videos, even a mock-up made in a free architecture tool. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see past my status and recognize the idea. Just the idea. I waited for a quiet moment, heart pounding, and handed Mr. Thompson the folder. His fingers didn't even pause from scrolling his phone. He looked at the first page, scoffed, and muttered, "That's adorable." Then he tossed it onto the corner of his desk like junk mail and added, "Sweetheart, you still confuse the copy machine with the microwave. Let's not pretend you're the brains of this operation." No one had called it adorable before. My ideas, my effort, my hope. I didn't take the folder back. I just stood there for a second, burning with something I couldn't name, and left it on his desk like a piece of myself I was done defending. He never mentioned it again. Neither did I. But that night, I started making my own version of a future, one where I never had to wait for approval to be intelligent. A few weeks later, it happened. I stayed late at school for a college readiness workshop, a rare chance to hear from people who had done what I dreamed of doing. The bus was late. My phone was out of data. I got home at 9:17 p.m. The house was dark, no porch light. The gate was locked. The garage door was shut. At first I thought maybe they were asleep. Then I saw it. Another folded note, this time pinned to the fence with a push pin. "We warned you." Actions have consequences. No signature. No blanket, no key under the mat, just consequences. I slept on a rolled-up garden hose that night, curled beneath the eaves as the sprinklers ticked on and soaked the concrete. I stared up at the stars and wondered if any of them had ever felt small. The next morning, Mr. Thompson stepped outside in his robe, glanced at me like I was a raccoon he had caught rummaging through the trash, and said, "Next time, try setting an alarm." I didn't answer. I was already setting one, inside me. It was a Tuesday, a random, uneventful Tuesday when the final cut came. Mrs. Thompson called me into the kitchen. Her tone was formal, her face unreadable. "We've decided to remove you from our insurance plan. It no longer makes sense financially." "No. Are you okay?" "No. Do you have a backup?" "No transition plan. Just a race." "Don't take it personally," she added. "You're almost an adult. We think it's time you start building your own foundation." Funny how people love talking about foundations when they're the ones standing on marble floors. What I heard wasn't a push toward independence. What I heard was, "We never really intended for you to stay." I nodded. I said thank you. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat in the garage that night, staring at the corners of my room, if you could call a slab of concrete and 4 walls covered in storage boxes a room, and whispered, "This is not where it ends." The day I turned 18, they handed me a thin envelope and a backpack that still smelled like bleach. No hugs. No, "We're proud of you." Just Mr. Thompson at the doorway, arms crossed, saying, Whatever happens next is on you now. If you end up begging for change, don't mention us. We've got investors." That was the last time I saw their front steps. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I carried that backpack down the driveway and out into a world that hadn't asked for me either. But at least the world didn't pretend to care. It was a strange kind of freedom, raw, unsheltered, real. And somewhere in that hollow space between unwanted and undefeated, I started building something else. Not just a business, not just a name, but a life that no one could take credit for but me. 15 years later, I walk into a high-rise boardroom with floor-to-ceiling glass, dressed in a blazer tailored to someone who no longer asks for a seat at the table because she owns the table now. And across from me, two people who used to hand me leftover scraps and call it parenting. They still don't recognize me, but they will. The boardroom was colder than I remembered, not the literal temperature, but the feel of it, the kind of polished, impersonal space built to impress people who think impressions matter more than impact. I used to believe that too, until I realized that true power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, and then it moves, silently. They were already seated when I arrived. Mr. Thompson was checking his watch, still wearing that thick-banded relic he used to tap against the table whenever he felt someone was wasting his time. Mrs. Thompson sat with her legs perfectly crossed, arms folded, smiling politely at the room as if she still believed her presence could broker trust. There were 6 other executives, 2 lawyers and a representative from my holding company, none of whom knew the real reason I was there, because I didn't come as myself. I came as the silent partner, the final signature, the one with the authority to close the deal. Their company, Thompson Building Solutions, had been bleeding revenue for years. Outdated logistics, supplier delays, internal mismanagement. They were looking for a merger, a buyout, a lifeline. My firm, North Spoke Holdings, had been negotiating for 6 months through intermediaries. Not once did they ask about the people behind the curtain. They assumed the woman in power was a faceless investor with no stake in their story. And maybe that would have been easier, but I needed to see them, not for revenge, for recognition, not of me, but of everything they never saw. The room stood as I entered. I didn't rush. I didn't look down. I wore slate gray, soft silk, no jewelry except a watch I bought myself the year I hit my first million. My heels were quiet. My presence wasn't. I sat at the head of the table. They still didn't flinch. The presentation began. Numbers, charts, synergy models. My VP laid out the transition plan. Our lawyer discussed executive realignments. Mr. Thompson raised a hand. Just to clarify, we'll remain in place for the next fiscal quarter to oversee integration? My VP paused, turned to me. That decision rests with our lead signatory. I smiled, once. Just enough. I leaned forward, pulled the final document toward me, and signed my name in blue ink. Catherin Ellis. I watched his eyes move to the signature, saw the confusion tighten at the corners of his mouth, then came the narrowing of his brows, then the pause. He looked up. "Catherin?" His voice trailed off like a dropped glass. Mrs. Thompson turned slowly, her face suddenly 2 shades paler. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just met their gaze and said, "You won't need to return to the office tomorrow. Your roles have been concluded. Transition teams will be in place by morning." Silence. One of their lawyers cleared his throat as if to object, but another executive gently held him back. They all felt it now. This wasn't a negotiation. This was done. Mr. Thompson blinked. "Wait, you're the—" I didn't let him finish. I stood, tucked the pen back into my coat pocket, and said, with the gentlest voice I've ever used, "I was never just the help. You just didn't look closely." Then I walked out. I didn't wait for them to respond. I didn't want an apology. Because if you have to ask someone to see you, their apology means nothing. That night, the press release went live. A quiet transition, no scandal, no name dropping. The Thompsons didn't return to the building. They didn't fight it, because they knew. And for the first time, so did I. I didn't need revenge. I had closure. The next morning, the building felt different. Not physically, no renovations yet, no banners, no brass plaques. But something had shifted in the air. A weight had lifted. A silence had settled in. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when even the windows seem to breathe again. The Thompsons didn't return. There was no dramatic firing, no grand announcement, just a blank space on the executive calendar where their names used to be. Meetings they once led were quietly reassigned. Their parking spots were left unclaimed. The receptionist stopped asking, "Should I hold your calls?" I kept every employee, every desk, every name tag except two, because I didn't come to erase the company. I came to recenter it. People had worked hard under the weight of that family's shadow. Foremen who never got bonuses, women in supply chain roles who were passed over for promotions, interns who left after 1 week because leadership made them feel invisible. Those were the ones I spoke to first, not in a grand town hall, just hallway conversations, casual check-ins, one-on-ones. I listened, took notes, let them talk about what had been wrong for years without anyone asking. And when they hesitantly asked me, "So what's your role in all this?" I smiled and simply said, "Let's just say I've been watching from a distance, and now I'm closer." By the end of the week, the office felt lighter. People began bringing lunch into the break room again. Someone left flowers at the front desk with a card that said, "To New Beginnings." I held a single meeting with senior leadership, the ones who had stayed silent under the Thompsons for too long. I didn't lecture. I asked them 2 questions. What would this company look like if you were proud of it? And what are you still afraid of? They didn't answer right away. That was fine. I was used to silence. By the end of the month, 2 department heads stepped down voluntarily, not because I asked them to, but because they knew the climate had changed and they didn't belong in it anymore. I never sent a termination letter, never revoked access with an angry swipe, but their email inboxes deactivated overnight, their executive assistants reassigned, their calendars, once packed with meetings, decisions, and handshakes, emptied like dried-out rivers. There was no ceremony, no goodbye cake, no chance to leave on their own terms. Exactly like the girl they once sent out the door with a $50 bill and a warning not to embarrass them. A junior project manager, young, nervous, eager, stopped me in the hallway one morning. They'll probably show up anyway, right? I mean, people like them don't just disappear. I paused, smiled. They'll try, but the locks have already changed. A week later, I received a letter. The handwriting was familiar. Sharp loops, firm slashes. Mr. Thompson. It read, "If you were angry, you should have just said something." This wasn't necessary. No apology, just the assumption that I owed him an explanation for my silence. I didn't reply. Not because I couldn't, but because I finally understood. Silence isn't weakness, it's clarity, it's control. I had screamed once, silently for years. Now I had nothing left to prove. They thought I'd be nothing. I became a mirror, and in that reflection they saw everything they never bothered to see. But I didn't stop there. Because revenge, no matter how quiet, has an expiration date. I wanted something that would outlive the moment. Something that would help someone else survive what I did, and maybe skip the 15-year detour. So I built something bigger than any merger. The letter came in a pale blue envelope. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Too formal to be affectionate, too rushed to be elegant. "Mr. Thompson," it began. "If you were angry, you should have said something. Families fight. They forgive." I read it once. then again, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer I never opened. He had finally called it a family, a word he never used when I was sleeping on concrete or eating after everyone else had finished. But now, when the balance of power had shifted, suddenly I was family. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer needed him to understand. Some truths don't require acknowledgement to be real. Some wounds don't need apologies to close, and some silences aren't emptiness. They're completion. A month after the merger, I used my first bonus payout to launch a project that had been living in my chest since the day I walked out of their house. The Foundry Project, a program for teens aging out of foster care. It included transitional housing, paid mentorships in logistics and tech, therapy sessions, and life skills coaching. I didn't plaster my name across it, didn't host a gala or cut a ribbon, but I was there, quietly, watching, the way I once wished someone had watched over me. One of the first girls we brought in was 17, wiry and guarded. She reminded me of myself, not in her face, but in her posture. The way she always sat near the exit, the way her eyes flicked toward the clock as if everything in life had an expiration. One night she asked me, "What made you want to do this?" I thought about lying, saying something noble or polished, but the truth came out before I could stop it. Because someone once told me I wouldn't be anything, and I believed them, for too long. She didn't say anything, just nodded. Then, for the first time, she stayed for the entire session. I used to think justice meant making them hurt the way I did, but justice isn't symmetry, it's liberation. And I am free, free from needing recognition, free from wondering, what if, free from hoping the people who broke me will someday fix themselves. They won't, but that doesn't mean I stay broken. Now I live in a quiet apartment with warm wood floors and books on every shelf. I eat at my own table. I light a candle every Sunday. Not for them, but for the girl I used to be. The one who stood at the edge of a locked garage door and whispered, "I will not disappear." And she didn't. She became me. I don't need them to say sorry. I just need the next girl not to hear the words, "You'll never be anything ever again." So I built a world where that voice doesn't get the final word. And that, I've learned, is the most powerful kind of silence of all.